Hello everyone, welcome to another new class of human physiology. In this class, we will discuss about menstruation cycle and the hormonal regulation. So, in the last few classes, remember we discussed about female reproductive organs. We will also discuss about the ovarian cycle. So, in this class, we will again cover like the ovarian cycle and uterine cycles. Along with that, we will discuss how different type of hormones has a very crucial role to play. So, let us stay with it. So, what different contents will be covered for this class? We will discuss like the main events of the menstruation cycle, we will discuss about different hormones that are involved in the menstruation cycle, we will discuss about the hormone initiations of the cycle, hormonal interactions in the ovary, then we will see like the role of estradiol, role of progesterone, we will also discuss about role of inhibin and role of like other hormones like FSH and LH. So, what are the main events of the menstruation cycle? First, we have to remember that the menstruation cycle is categorized into two components, right. So, the first one is the ovarian cycle and then the second one is the uterine cycle, right. So, basically as a whole the total cycle stays about 21 days, right, and in cases of ovarian cycle there are certain component that you already remember we discussed in our last class. So, for example, like first what happens is like the egg starts to mature where follicle or follicular maturation happens, which is basically the development of the follicles in the ovary. Then after when the follicular maturation happens and then inside of the egg from the meiosis 1 it gets to the meiosis 2 and then it arrested in the meiosis 2. You remember the next stage at day 18 the ovulation of at day 14 the ovulation of the oocyte or ovulation of the egg happens, and finally after the ovulation what happens is like the remaining granulosa cells or follicular cells they convert into a component called corpus luteum. This structure is basically formed after the ovulation, and as we discussed that corpus luteum has a very crucial role to play, and we will see like how corpus luteum actually is so important. So, this is all about different kind of stages of the ovarian cycle where initially follicle maturation happen followed by ovulation and followed by the formation of the corpus luteum. In cases of the uterine cycle, mostly like what happens is the growth of the uterus. So, initially after the initial periods which happens initially like 1 to 7 days, slowly in presence of like different hormones the uterine gets developed. So, uterine growth happens, endometrium growth happens, basically uterine and endometrium it prepares itself for like possible embryonic implantation. So, one more time it mostly in cases of the menstruation cycle it has basically like two phases. One is the which is called as follicular phase, second is called the luteal phase. So, in cases of follicular phase as we know like mostly the maturation of egg happens where like the egg starts to like grow, the follicle starts to develop, and in cases of luteal phase the corpus luteum develop, and eventually the total cycle is about like 0 to 28 days, the whole cycle is about 28 days. One thing you have to remember that this luteal phase specifically which is mostly in the like after the day 14 to like day 28 days. So, this gap of 14 days needs to be there and it is always there in cases of a female body. But in cases of a longer and shorter menstruation cycle the follicular phase can vary. You remember in the last class also we discussed that in cases of like a regular 28 days cycle what we see the ovulation, we see the ovulation at day 14, right. But if the cycle is short, so for example if the cycle is short you still have to remember that the this luteal phase still need 14 days, right. So, this initial follicular phase will only be for 7 days. And in cases of a longer time of period, for example, if it is a 35 days, right. So, basically still the 14 days of the luteal phase would be there. That means like there would be about 21 days of follicular phase. So, there would be about 21 days of follicular phase with only 14 days of luteal phase. So basically important part here is that the luteal phase needs to be maintained at least for the 14 days, but the follicular phase can vary based on the shorter or longer time period. So let us see the primary reason for today's lecture is to discuss about different hormones that have crucial role in the ovarian and the uterine cycle, right. So there are mostly 5 different hormones that are involved. So we will see like exactly what are their role and from where they secrete. Okay. So basically the first hormone which we will discuss, which is the FSH or follicular stimulating hormone. This gets secreted from the pituitary, mostly like the anterior part of the pituitary, and this has a role for follicular maturation. Then the second important hormone that gets also secreted from the anterior pituitary, which is called the luteinizing hormone or LH. LH has different role. LH is highly important for the ovulation. Along with that, LH has crucial role for the corpus luteum formation. Then in terms of uterine cycle, of course the uterine cycle is mostly the role is like to develop the uterus, to develop and grow the endometrium. In these cases 2 important hormone has a very crucial role. One is estradiol and second is the progesterone. So what are 5 hormones we discussed? Lastly, like also another important hormone we should discuss, which is the gonadotropic releasing hormone. These basically gets secreted from hypothalamus. So basically it gets secreted from hypothalamus, and these are like the precursor hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete like the FSH and the LH. Okay, so we will see again how this kind of the whole hormonal signaling happens, but in short there are 5 different like important hormones. The first one is the follicle stimulating hormone. This stimulates the maturation of the ovarian follicles. Then there is this luteinizing hormone, which has very crucial role in terms of oocyte ovulation. It also is very important in terms of estradiol synthesis or estrogen synthesis. LH also has crucial role for corpus luteum formation. Then estradiol, which is like a form of estrogen that helps to basically prepare the uterus for possible embryo implantation. It is also very important. Then progesterone, progesterone is highly important because progesterone works simultaneously with estrogen to basically form and develop the uterus and the endometrium. And lastly we said that GnRH or gonadotropic releasing hormone, that is a precursor hormone or stimulating hormone which gets secreted from the hypothalamus, and it basically stimulates and triggers the anterior side of pituitary to secrete basically the FSH and the LH. So important thing is like the locations also you have to remember. So basically FSH is secreted from anterior pituitary, LH is secreted also from anterior pituitary, right. Then gonadotropic releasing hormone is secreted from hypothalamus. Then estradiol, which is initially produced in the granulosa cells. Then progesterone, which is basically secreted from corpus luteum. Okay, so these are the areas where from these hormones are secreted. Let us see how the hormonal initiation of this cycle happens. So as we said, the first after the puberty, just before each cycle, what happens basically like from the hypothalamus, this gonadotropic releasing hormone that gets secreted. And you know, like hypothalamus is there in our brain, and once this gonadotropic releasing hormone is secreted from the hypothalamus via the hypophyseal portal system, it comes to the anterior side of the pituitary. So on the frontal or the anterior side of the pituitary, basically this gonadotropic releasing hormone comes, right. And once it comes to anterior side of the pituitary, it stimulates the gonadotrope cells which are present in the anterior pituitary, and by stimulating these gonadotrope cells in the anterior pituitary, it kind of stimulates the secretion of 2 hormones. One is the luteinizing hormone, right, one is the luteinizing hormone or LH, and then second is the follicle stimulating hormone or FSH. So follicle stimulating hormone or FSH, and then another is the luteinizing hormone or LH. Then once this LH and FSH which gets secreted from the anterior side of the pituitary, what basically happens is like they travel via the blood stream to the ovary. So basically these two hormone LH and FSH comes to the ovary, and there the ovarian cycle basically start. So let's see how it starts and what are the different role of this hormone. So FSH, which is you can see by the name, which is called as follicle stimulating hormone, and what FSH does is basically it stimulates the egg maturation, it stimulates this follicle formation. So you can see that initially there were like thin layer of follicle cells, and slowly from the initial stromal cells it became cuboidal cell, and after that it start to develop like the granulosa cell. But the main thing is like this follicular cells or the follicles are eventually getting matured and developed, and FSH has a very crucial role in terms of developing and maturation of these follicles. And then next is the LH or the luteinizing hormone. LH basically acts on the theca layer, right. So this is basically the theca layer, this red layer you remember we have discussed in our last class also. So it acts on the theca interna cells in the follicle, and by stimulating these theca interna cells, what it does is like it basically kind of secretes a molecule which is called androstenedione. So what it does, LH basically acts on the theca interna cells, and after the theca interna cells get stimulated by the LH, it secretes a precursor molecule of estrogen which is called as androstenedione. And now this androstenedione, what it does, it basically affects the granulosa cells, and once it diffuse inside of the granulosa cells, it converts to a molecule which is called as estrogen or estradiol. So what we just said, initially from the hypothalamus, it secretes the gonadotropic releasing hormone, and once the gonadotropic releasing hormone is secreted, this hormone basically stimulates the anterior pituitary. So it stimulates the anterior side of the pituitary, right, and by stimulating the anterior side of the pituitary, it secretes two different hormone. One is the luteinizing hormone, and then second is the follicle stimulating hormone. This follicle stimulating hormone basically stimulates the follicle formation, maturation of the follicles, and eventually it stimulates the formation of granulosa cells. Whereas on the other side, the luteinizing hormone basically it acts on the theca interna to secrete a precursor molecule which is called androstenedione, and androstenedione can actually diffuse inside of the granulosa cell to produce the hormone which is called the estrogen or estradiol, and this estradiol has an important role in terms of uterus growth. So you see in this chart, so what we discussed is initially, for example, this FSH is slowly going, right, it is almost like initially it starts when the GnRH stimulates the anterior pituitary, the FSH level goes little bit high on the body, and then basically it maintains till like about like day 9 to like day 10, which contributes like the follicle maturation and follicle development. And when there are a lot of this granulosa cell formation, what LH does, it basically stimulates these theca interna cells. By stimulating the theca interna cells, it forms like androstenedione. Androstenedione, these molecules further diffuse inside of the granulosa cells, and it starts to secrete the estradiol or estrogen. So basically this is the estrogen level. So you can see like slowly with time, once the granulosa cells are getting thicker and more in number, the estrogen level is also going high. And what this estrogen or estradiol does is like they basically starts to proliferate, basically it proliferate and grow the endometrium level inside of the uterine. So basically with the estrogen, it is maintaining the endometrium, it is growing the endometrium, and it is preparing the uterus for the possible embryonic implantation. So in the next stage, as you can see, the very interesting thing is like this estradiol has a negative feedback effect on both the hypothalamus, hypothalamus along with the anterior pituitary. So directly or indirectly this estrogen one, when it is formed, basically it has a inhibitory effect. So up to a certain time the FSH and LH level, so basically this is the FSH and the yellow line is the LH. So initially they were maintaining at a stable level, but once the estrogen starts to form, they have a inhibitory effect because they directly inhibit both hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, so that not more than LH and the FSH is being secreted. And when it inhibits, you see the LH and FSH level drops. So basically after like maybe like day 8 or day 9, LH and the FSH level drops till like day around 11 to 12, right. So you can see that where LH level, LH and the FSH level little bit drops. Now what happens is like there is a saturation or there is like a threshold level. You can see like continuously the granulosa cells are proliferating, causing like the maturation of the egg, and when there is like almost like a formation of this Graafian follicle or the dominant follicle, then there is continuous increase of the estradiol level, right. So at a certain threshold level, certain threshold level, this previous negative feedback loop, so this previous negative feedback loop which was initially established maybe at this range, this negative feedback loop basically goes away and it basically switches to a positive feedback loop. I know this can be little complicated, but quickly we will rehearse one more time that initially when LH and FSH forms, FSH starts to kind of produce the granulosa cells and LH basically forms the androstenedione basically diffuse inside of the granulosa cells to form the estrogen or estradiol. Estradiol has a negative feedback loop effect that basically kind of inhibit both hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to secrete more and more LH and FSH. So it prevents secretion of further LH and FSH. And that's why you can see from this 8 to 9 days to like 11 to 12 days there is a decrease in the level of both FSH and LH. But after that day, because granulosa cells continuously they are also proliferating, that is also causing like continuous like production of the estradiol. So after a certain threshold, that negative feedback switch that kind of gets switched off. Okay. So initially the negative feedback loop was there, basically this negative feedback loop gets terminated and it kind of switches over as a positive feedback loop. And whenever there is this positive feedback loop, what happens? Both FSH and LH, immediately the production of FSH and LH is surged. So you can see FSH, this green line is also surged, right. And then in cases of LH also the surge is much prominent, which is also called as LH surged. Okay. So in this case, this both surge of LH and FSH together, especially the LH surge, has significant role because why LH surge is so important, that LH surge for this just 36 hours before the ovulation, it basically helps in terms of completing the meiosis 1, and also it kind of matured the oocyte to form like a secondary oocyte. It also contributes in terms of ovulation, which is the release of the oocyte. Finally, LH or LSH surge is also important to form the corpus luteum. So we will discuss about corpus luteum in the next slide, but before that, one more important kind of point to see or try to remember, you see like this FSH surge. So basically this is the LH, right, and this is the FSH. So you see like the FSH surge is not as bigger than the LH surge. So the LH surge is much larger than the FSH surge. And why this is so? Because from this granulosa cells there is another hormone, another molecule which is called as inhibin. So basically these inhibin molecules are secreted from the granulosa cells, and this inhibin kind of negatively reduce or negatively kind of like hamper or restrict the too much of FSH surge. So what it does, this inhibin molecule is basically secreted from the granulosa cells and it suppresses over FSH secretion. and this explains why the FSH is not as high, the surge of FSH is not as high like the surge of LH. So, we already discussed the role of LH surge, right. What we told, LH surge is highly important because it allows to complete the meiosis one step, it allows to form the secondary oocyte, it allows like the female body to complete the ovulation at day 14, and eventually it helps to form the corpus luteum. Now, when the corpus luteum basically forms, basically what happens at this stage after the day 14, you can see that there is a sharp kind of decrease of the estradiol, because why? That initial egg or this initial granulosa cells are now converted to like the corpus luteum by help of LH surge, right, and this is formed like a yellow body. And now there is no presence of any more granulosa cells, and that is why you can see there is a sharp drop of basically this estradiol level, right. So, you can see there is a sharp drop of estrogen level whenever this granulosa cell is converted to the corpus luteum. Now, what is the basic role of corpus luteum? Corpus luteum basically primarily produce in the early stage, it is produce the progesterone hormone. And why progesterone is so important? Because progesterone in the early stages, you remember in the early stages, estradiol was basically estrogen was mostly the responsible for the uterine growth, but after the day 14, so after the day 14, once the corpus luteum forms, it basically secretes the progesterone, and now this progesterone molecule helps in terms of further growth of endometrium, and it also makes the endometrium vascularized. So, there are like lot of blood vessel formation, lot of capillary formation. So, basically the body is preparing the uterus with a stable and vascularized endometrium for a possible embryonic implantation, because if the embryo is implanted, then it needs lot of nutrient, lot of oxygen, and these blood capillaries or the blood vessels of the endoneurium is facilitates to supply the oxygen nutrients to the newly formed embryo. So, you can see, and who basically secretes the progesterone? This corpus luteum. So, you can see that initially progesterone level, so this blue sky blue line is the progesterone level. For on the first 14 days the progesterone level is too low, there is almost negligible amount of progesterone or almost no presence of progesterone, and now you can see that after the day 14 the progesterone level sharply increases. So, the progesterone level is like sharply increases because the corpus luteum is forming the progesterone. And after a certain time, two things can happen. So, at this point either fertilization can happen. So, basically let us consider two conditions. If fertilization happen, right. So, if fertilization happens, then what will happen? If fertilization happen, then basically the progesterone level will be maintained, and we will see like why it will be maintained. But let us consider if there is no fertilization. So, let us consider if there is no fertilization, then basically the progesterone level will drop, right. So, if there is no fertilization, then there is no need for the body to maintain this corpus luteum, and you remember in the last class we discussed the corpus luteum eventually becomes a white body. So, initially it was the yellow body which was called corpus luteum. If there is no fertilization, it forms corpus albicans, or white body. What it forms? It forms corpus albicans or white body. Eventually there is no more like progesterone formation, and as the progesterone formation has stopped, you can see this sky blue line, the progesterone level also immediately and sharply decreased till day 28. So, we just discussed two conditions, right. If fertilization occurs, then the embryo which developed or formed after the fertilization, it will secrete a hormone which is called the HCG or human chorionic gonadotropic hormone, and this HCG hormone will basically help the corpus luteum to maintain. So, if the fertilization occurs, the embryo will secrete the HCG, and this HCG hormone will help the corpus luteum to maintain. So, it will support the endometrium to maintain, it will support the vascularization and proliferation of the endometrium thick layer to maintain for the proper embryonic implantation and overall embryonic health and growth. But if fertilization does not occur, what we said, corpus luteum will become like a inactive white body, right? It will become like a inactive white body, which is also called as corpus, albicans. And once it forms like a inactive form of corpus albicans, it will not be able to secrete any further progesterone hormone. So, eventually progesterone level will drop. One last thing to remember, you see for this estradiol or for this estrogen hormone, for this estrogen line, this is a dark blue line. So, initially there was a dip just because like granulosa cells got converted to corpus luteum cells. But you can see in the mid phase of the mid luteal phase, almost like around maybe like day 20 to day 22, there is again another second level of increase of this hormone. You can see initially there was a fast decrease, right, and that we know why, because the granulosa cells are proliferating, and after the granulosa cells converted to the corpus luteum or yellow body, there is a decrease. But there is again another round of increase in cases of this mid luteal phase. And do you know why it happens? Because the corpus luteum around like day 20 to 22, it does not only secrete the progesterone, it also starts to secrete some amount of estrogen. So, estrogen level, you can see at this point there is another rise or surge of estrogen level, because corpus luteum around day 20 to day 24, both it secretes progesterone and estrogen level. So, what is basically finally like we completed almost both the ovarian cycle and menstruation cycle till day 28, but let us see like what is basically menstruation. So, when there is no fertilization, what happened? Basically, you remember in the last slide we discussed both the progesterone level as well as the estrogen level completely went down. And if there is no progesterone and no estrogen level in the blood or in the body, what will happen? The endometrium of the uterus will eventually starts to degrade. It will basically all those thick endometrium layer, you can see the initial formation of the endometrium and endometrium layer, these layers will kind of come off and eventually they will kind of start to degrade, degenerate, and that also cause like lot of surrounding tissue layer like which will come out, lot of blood loss, or eventually with the blood plus the tissue, which will come out in form of periods, right. So, this is basically called as menstruation in cases of fertilization which does not occur, and the female will experience like about initial first 1 to maybe like 2 to 7 days of menstruation or heavy bleeding, followed by again next phases of menstruation cycle will initiate. Okay. So, let us think about it, how long does the menstruation cycle typically last, what is basically the role of corpus luteum, why is the menstruation cycle important? So, can you kind of think and answer this question? You can refer also this textbook. If you have further questions, please discuss with us during the live sessions. You can also drop your questions via email. So, thank you again. Hopefully, you are enjoying the human physiology classes. We will meet with you very soon with another new class of human physiology. Thank you.